Hi everyone, hello. If you can hear me okay, if you can just write yes in the chat box. Yeah, perfect. So we've got someone from Peru saying hello. Yeah, from Georgia, from Russia. Excellent. Poland, Czech Republic, Germany, Argentina. Nice. So people coming from all over. So welcome and thanks so much for coming today. So today we'll be talking about the ESAP or ESAP methodology for Speak Out second edition. So we'll just wait for a couple more people to join. Okay, yeah. So we've got Ukraine, Bolivia, Russia, Malaysia, Switzerland. So lots and lots of different times of day as well coming in. Cyprus, Slovakia. Nice. India, Kosovo. Someone from the UK. I'm also in the UK. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks again so much for coming today. If you haven't introduced yourself in the chat box, feel free to say hello and where you're coming from and watching from. So just a few housekeeping points before we get started. So this webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to find it online, and you'll also receive a link in an email 72 hours after this webinar if you did want to watch it back as well. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance, a link to Pearson's ESAP pack, which includes a cheat sheet and a lesson planner to help you reduce your planning time, which we'll have a look at in a moment. As I said, you'll also get a link to the recording and a link to a really useful online guide called How to Teach Online with Speak Out second edition. So that will break down all of the teacher and student resources, as well as include another ESAP lesson in there for you as well. So as I said, you'll receive all of this in an email. So do just check your junk or spam box if you haven't received this within 3 days of this webinar. So I'll be asking you guys questions throughout the session. So please do write any comments or answers to the questions in the chat box. And if you do have any questions, do try and save them until the end when we'll have some time to go through them. But if you do have any burning questions, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box as well. So hi to everyone who's just joined. We've got people coming from Argentina, Germany, Ukraine, the Philippines, 11 p.m. Thanks for joining so late in the evening. Dilkash asked about the certificate yet. So as I said, you'll receive a certificate, a cheat sheet and a planner 72 hours after this webinar. So here's a quick look at the cheat sheet and the planner that I just mentioned. So hopefully this should help reduce your planning time for your online lessons, as it breaks down each stage into sections. And the cheat sheet talks about the resources you can use and where to find them as well for each stage of your lesson. So a little bit about me before we get started. So my name is Billy and I've been in English language teaching for just over 9 years, firstly as a teacher in different countries around the world, so China, Italy, Spain, and then back to the UK where I'm now based. And then I did my Delta and I taught at a language school in Cambridge. And then I moved on to teacher training and as a freelance materials writer as well, writing mostly course books, exam course books and apps. And I also have my own teacher training podcast as well. Now, let's have a quick overview of what we're going to look at in this session. So first of all, we'll be having a quick look at what the ESAP methodology actually is. So there was a detailed introduction into this method last week with Magdalena Kania. So if you missed that, do just check that out. There will be a link to that online. And if you did miss that, we'll have a quick look through at what stage is in each section. So engage, study, activate, and practice. Then we'll look at the ways you can plan a lesson using the planner, which will be sent after the webinar. And then we'll move on to how we can actually deliver an online ESAP lesson with Speak Out second edition. So we'll look at the tools you can use, the different methods of feedback, and alternative ways to conduct tasks to make sure students are still engaged as well. And then finally, we'll look at the digital resources available that you can use for independent study for your students. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do have any questions, then we'll have some time at the end to go through and answer those as well. Okay, so let's have a look at what ESAP or ESAP stands for. So we've got engage in the top left corner, then we've got study, then the third stage is activate, and finally we've got practice. So has anyone used this methodology before? If you have, just let us know in the chat box. Yeah, so Renata says she's used it before. Yeah, lots of people coming through saying they're using it. Okay, nice. Some people said they haven't used it yet. So hopefully we can break it down and you can use the lesson that we're going to look at today in your online lesson as well. So first of all, we've got engage. So this is where students first enter the online classroom and are engaged from the very first moment. So this could be asking questions to students about their day, how they are, what they've been doing, for example. Then we have a warmer activity where students get thinking about the unique topic. So this could be through lead-in discussion questions, for example. And then we retrieve the prior language and knowledge that they have on this topic as well. Moving on to the second part. So we have study, which is the presentation and practice section of the lesson. So this is where we introduce new language and then students complete controlled activities. So this stage differs quite a lot from a face-to-face lesson because the main goal here is to ensure that the teacher talking time is kept to a minimum and that we use different ways to present language rather than simply explaining with words and causing students to lose interest as well. So with online lessons, I think it's really important to keep students engaged in the presentation of language, the practice and the feedback, rather than just the heads down approach, which can be tricky in an online class. Then we have activate. So this is where students have the opportunity to practice the language themselves in a freer way. And this involves a lot of oral production. So we can use things like pair and group work, discussions, and generally just trying to get students to use the language as much as possible with personalization activities. And finally, the fourth stage is practice. So this is where students can do further activities and exercises out of the lesson for self-study, perhaps to reinforce what they've learned in the lesson or for extra support or challenge. So we're really encouraging independent learning here. So now we are going to have a look at a lesson from Speak Out, second edition. So let's first of all think about our planning. So do you find it takes longer to plan online lessons than face-to-face? And how long does it usually take you to plan your online lessons? So if you can just write your answers in the chat box, I'll just give you a moment. Okay, so lots of you saying that it takes longer for online lessons. Yeah, Gail said because you have to change a lot of things. Exactly. A lot of the activities that you have in a student's book maybe might not work in an online classroom. Eva says longer as I have to look for more material. Exactly. So we'll look at a way that we can put all of our material in one place and find it easily as well. It was longer at the beginning. Now it's the same. Yeah, I think as time goes on, we do get more comfortable with planning, and also we can find different platforms that work for our students and our lessons, whereas ones that don't as well. So Angelina said more than an hour and longer. Yeah. Megan talked about conceptualizing. Yeah, exactly. It's hard to know sort of what's going to work and what's not going to work. And yeah, as someone mentioned, there are a lot of different platforms as well. So I think it's just really important that we have our technology sort of in one place so that we're not sort of losing students' interest as we're trying to get to each platform. So here's a quick look at the lesson plan for today. So as I said, every teacher does plan lessons differently, and you will get a copy of this to help you plan your ESAP lesson as well. So yeah, after this webinar, you'll receive a copy of this emailed to you. So hopefully this does reduce your planning time, as lots of you said it does take you longer, maybe an hour to an hour and a half. So because we're using a lot of digital resources in the lesson, we just need to have that technology sorted, as we said. We need to know where we're going to find each component. So hopefully the planner can help you save time in your planning, as you can clearly see the steps you need to take. For example, engage, then study, then activate, then practice. And there's two things that I'd recommend to write in the notes section, which we have on the right-hand side. So firstly, you can use this to help you know where to access your digital tools. So for example, you can see in my study section, I've got mentimeter.com, which is a resource we're going to look at a bit later on. And the second thing I'd use the notes section for is to write how you're going to get feedback on particular activities, because this is completely different to a real world classroom where we can simply choose students to say their answers. So we can use things like peer feedback in breakout rooms, students writing in the chat box, or nominating students to unmute themselves, for example, and speaking aloud. So I'd probably just make a note in that notes column there of how feedback can be done in each activity, so that you're not wasting time trying to figure out the best way to do it in the lesson while students' minds are wandering. You could also write how you're going to set up each activity. So for example, are you going to do it in the main lesson, in pairs, in breakout rooms, or in groups? So as I said, every teacher is different and does plan differently, but hopefully by using the online lesson planner that you'll be sent out, you can follow the ESAP methodology and reduce the planning time just by breaking the lesson down into clear sections as well. So one more thing I think which is really important to mention before we do go into our online lesson is that you can access Zoom through the Pearson English portal and schedule classes with your students through there too. So by accessing Zoom through the portal, you've got everything in one place, from your presentation tool to your digital teacher resources. So just log on to your teacher dashboard on the Pearson English portal, and next to your products and classes, you'll see class schedule. So you'll need to connect your Zoom account and all of your lessons will appear on your dashboard. So another thing to mention is that you can share your screen with students and display ActiveTeach, which is also on the Pearson English portal, and we'll put a link to that in the chat box as well. So this is the digital version of the student's book, and we'll look at this in detail a little bit more later on as well. So Renata said, can you do the same in Teams? I believe you can share your screen in Teams as well, and any other video platform that you use to teach your lessons. And Mara asked if Speak Out has a presentation tool. So you can use ActiveTeach, which is your presentation tool. The only difference is that you share your screen rather than projecting it as you would at the front of the class. You can use ActiveTeach, and we'll have a look at that in a little bit as well. So now let's have a look at how we can use our plans and ideas to deliver an online lesson with the ESAP framework and Speak Out second edition. So we're going to be using Intermediate, Unit 4, Listening and Grammar, because grammar can be quite tricky to teach in an online lesson. If we can't see our students, we're not sure if they're listening or engaged. So we're going to be looking at Listening and Grammar, page 47 and 48. So as we know, the first stage of our lesson is engage. So a question for you guys, if you can write your answers in the chat box. So what's the first thing you do when students enter your online lesson? There's no right or wrong answer here. It'll just be interesting to see the different ideas. So if you just write your answers in the chat box. Yeah, so small talk, general chat about the week. Tatiana, check the connection. I think that's really important, first of all. Yep, say hello, ask about their week. Nice, greet them, ask about their routines, their day, their week. Excellent. So this is exactly what the ESAP framework expects, essentially. So first of all, it's asking students how they are, how's their day's been, or what they've been doing, for example. So this just really shows that we care, that we're engaging our students, and we're also linking the real world to the online classroom as well. So I think most of us would do this in a real life classroom anyway, and most of you do this online, as you're saying in the chat box. But it's important just to get students thinking in English and just really get their minds working and engaged and prepared to learn. So you could ask students to write their answers in the chat box if you ask them a question, or you could nominate students to unmute themselves if they're still coming into the lesson and say a couple of sentences about their day. If the lesson you're teaching that day links to a previous lesson, you could ask questions about the language or topic from that lesson. You could assign extra practice tasks to students on their online practice. Again, we'll have a look at that a bit later on. And you could use the common error report in the gradebook to tell you what you need to go over or revisit. So you could base your introductory questions around the topic that you did in the previous lesson. So on the gradebook, the teacher can see the student scores from the assigned activities and which activities the students or the class in general struggled with as well. As I say, we will have a look at that a little bit later on. Susan, I know you've just asked about that in the chat box. So if you're unsure on how to use the gradebook, after we've had a look at it, there will also be a breakdown of this in the how-to guide sent to you after the webinar in an email. So do be sure to have a look at this, as all of the digital resources are really useful tools which support students and teachers, and they reduce your planning time by having everything in one place, and just provides that extra practice your students might need as well. So let's have a look at the first page of our unit. So remember, we're doing intermediate unit 4 and we're focusing on listening and grammar. So you'll see, first of all, we've got an arrow pointing to the leading question. So we're still on the engage stage of our lesson. So students work in pairs and use the photos on the page to answer the questions. So what are these jobs? Would you like to do them? And what is your idea of a dream job? So the second question really elicits students' existing knowledge of the target language of jobs. And during feedback, you could pull out some really great examples from students to learn from each other as well, perhaps jobs that aren't featured on the page. So for this activity, depending on how long you want to make it, you could have students just write their ideas in the chat box, or you could organise breakout rooms, which are available on Zoom and potentially other video platforms as well. And students could chat in pairs or groups about their ideas. It might not be as important for the lead-in as other sections of the lesson, but do make sure you pop in and out of breakout rooms if you can, to make sure students are on topic and that they're speaking in English, particularly if you do have a monolingual class, so students that all speak the same language. Next, we have the activity which leads into the listening. So it's a gist listening, and students get to sort of listen to language in context as well. So this is quite a short activity. So we're looking at exercise 2A, as you can see on the screen. So I'd probably keep this as a short activity, have them write their answers in the chat box once we've played the audio. So we're matching the speaker to the photos. So for the second part of the lesson, so part B, you could combine this with activity A if your students are confident and you think they can listen for 2 things at once. Or you could play the audio again and then put students into breakout rooms to discuss the problem of each speaker. This is quite good because they get to paraphrase the language and practice their English in a different way as well. And then once you're back in the main lesson, you could nominate groups to unmute themselves and share their ideas. For the third part of the listening, so 2C, as you can see here, it's listening in more detail. So you could do this in a number of ways. Firstly, you could play the audio in the main lesson and have students simply write their answers, though maybe they'll become disengaged as they listen to the same thing for the third time. So you could direct students to listen to the audio on their own. So you put them into breakout rooms to listen and work together to come up with the answers. So you could get feedback back in the main lesson, perhaps by showing the audio script and having students write their answers in the chat box as they see them in the audio script on screen. So alternatively, and this is the option I would likely go for, is to complete the activity as a class in the main lesson. So getting everyone to collaborate and work together. So we can get feedback in a more engaging way, such as using a platform called Mentimeter, which most of you have probably heard of. So this way, students' answers are anonymous. So if they don't feel particularly confident with listening, you'll be able to see that, and that this is a skill you might need to focus on in later lessons. So let's have a quick look at Mentimeter. So before the lesson, you would need to create this just to save time. And you can see my first question here, which relates back to the student's book. So you go to mentimeter.com, which is at the bottom of the screen here, and you write each sentence on a different slide with the 3 options. So we've got Amy, Nicola, or Luca, who had a boss that worked in the media. So students then use their phones. They go to menti.com, enter the code at the top of the screen that you can see here. So we've got 9969 and so on. And as I said, it is anonymous, so it might be better to get feedback in a task like this, particularly if students aren't confident with writing their answers in the chat box, if they're unsure if they've got the correct answer. So if students have come across this task for the first time, perhaps it might be good to do feedback this way, or if you know that they're less confident or of a low level in listening. It's also just more engaging and a different way of providing feedback as well. So has anyone used Mentimeter before? If you can just write in the chat box. I think Sonia said she'd used it before. Someone said, can students hear the audio we're playing in the breakout rooms? No, they can't unless you're in the main lesson. However, students do have access to the e-text, which is the digital version of the student's book. And as they're looking at that, so you'll just need to tell them the page number. The audio icon means they can play it directly from that page online, so they can do it in breakout rooms together. So lots of you have said you've used it. This is completely free to use. There are limitations on what you can do with the free version, but it is still very good. You can do things like word clouds, ranking tasks, class votes as well. It does look like Kahoot. Yeah, it's quite similar to Kahoot as well. You could use that. Okay, so yeah, students would just need their phones to do this activity. But as I said, it is more engaging than just sort of writing answers in the chat box. So on to the next section of our study lesson. So this next part moves on to vocabulary. So we're focusing on extreme adjectives. So first of all, I'd likely say different adjectives out loud, for example, hot or boiling. And we can ask students if we think they're normal adjectives or extreme adjectives. So one way to do this and to make it engaging for students is to have them turn on their camera for maybe 5 minutes so it doesn't interrupt our connection or our bandwidth. And students have a piece of paper. One side they've got N, the other side they've got E. Then you say an adjective and students either show N or E, depending on what they think. So if they think it's a normal adjective, N, an extreme adjective, E. And you could give a couple of examples first if you prefer as well. So if you prefer to do it in the chat box, you could just do this as a quiz as well, just with students writing N or E in the chat box as well. But I think sometimes it's nice to have students turning on their cameras just so they do remember that there are other people in the class as well, and they can see their faces and just feel more engaged too. So now we're moving on to the next part of our lesson, which is still the study stage. So we're showing the audio script from page 167. And again, if you're using ActiveTeach, this is all in the same place. Or if you're presenting from the e-text as well, this is all in the same place, as you can see on screen here. So it's accessible from your toolbar. So you could have students complete this task individually in the main lesson, or have students access the audio script on their e-text and then put students into breakout rooms to work together. Then back in the main lesson, I'd recommend sort of students nominating each other to say their answers aloud. And this is a really good way to check students are listening by having them nominate their peers, because they have to listen for their name, and then they can also practice the pronunciation as well. So if you do hear any errors in pronunciation when you ask students to unmute themselves, you can simply drill this by saying it, maybe having all the class unmute themselves and just repeating it 1 or 2 times as well. So the next activity in our study stage is the gap fill. So we can try and do this without just having sort of a heads down individual approach here. So the adjectives we need were seen in the previous exercise. So this is sort of retrieving and revising what students have just learned. So you can put students into breakout rooms to work together to complete the sentences. And for extra support, have students use that audio script again. As we said, they can find it in their e-text, as we can see on screen here, just in the left-hand side of their toolbar. So you could have them use the audio script for extra support, or you could just have them try and remember the words as well for an extra challenge. So back in the main lesson, you could nominate pairs of students to read the questions and answers aloud, again to practice pronunciation as well, because sometimes it's quite hard to get students practicing their oral English, particularly in an online lesson where there aren't any opportunities to just sort of speak to each other across the room. Okay, so still on our study stage, we're now looking at grammar, something which is really tricky to teach in an online classroom because we don't want to sort of lose our students' interest. So we really need to think about reducing our teacher talking time when we present grammar and just taking a different approach than we would perhaps in the classroom. So our grammar point here is used to and would for talking about past states and habits. So first of all, as you can see, we have two short texts with a gist reading question. So you could do this part quite quickly, displaying the text and have students individually make a note of their answers. And then you could have students simply write their answers in the chat box and then perhaps elicit which language helped them find their answers. So really trying to elicit used to and would here. Then for activity B, you could put students into breakout rooms to discuss the rules and match the example sentences. So really getting them to sort of get the language out here themselves and retrieve any prior knowledge as well. So for an extra challenge, you could ask students to write their own example sentences. So this is an extension activity and doesn't appear in the student's book itself. So this will be quite tricky, of course, if this is the first time they've come across this grammar, but it will help you as a teacher know who might have come across this grammar point before and just how in depth you need to go with it as well. So someone mentioned students filling out the exercise before they go into the breakout rooms. It definitely depends how you want to tackle the activity. You could have students do it individually, or you could have them work in breakout rooms to work collaboratively, which I think works really nice for most sort of gap fill activities as well. Okay, so then the student's book refers to the language bank on page 134 of your book. So here there is an explanation of the grammar in more detail, as well as two practice exercises which you could repurpose. So the first one, you could turn this into a quiz, a whole class quiz to get everyone working together. So once students have had a chance to read the grammar reference if they need it, or perhaps you could get them to do that after the class for self-study if they're already aware of this. So you could read the sentences aloud in the first activity we have in the bottom left here. So exercise A 4.2. So you could have students write A, B or C in the chat box, and then you could award points for correct answers. Although A, B and C are not marked in the exercise, you could just take the first italicized option as A, the middle one as B and the last one as C, for example. If you are doing it as awarding points for students, you do have access to a scoreboard if you're presenting through Active Teach. So you can keep a track of scores and you can add or remove as many teams as you like as well. And so for the second practice activity, which we have on the bottom right, you could either do this in class in breakout rooms, or you could use it for the practice section of the lesson at the end, where students work on their own on the target grammar and language for self-study as well. So the final activity in our study section, students complete the text using used to or would, so the grammar point you've just focused on. So there are two different ways you could use this activity. So you could have students complete an activity, perhaps on paper, and then compare their answers together and sort of get feedback on their own in the breakout rooms if you do have a higher level or more confident class. Or you could just have students work collaboratively to complete both tests in the breakout rooms, which may work better for keeping students motivated, engaged, and just sort of peer teaching as well. And if possible, do try and pair different students if you do use breakout rooms, so that students are working with different classmates and trying to learn from someone new each time, because you might have a really confident student who's really aware of this, just teaching maybe a less confident student who's come across this grammar point for the first time. I know a lot of you have mentioned popping in and out of breakout rooms in the boxes, in the chat box as well. I think it's inevitable if you do have a monolingual class that they are going to revert back to their own language. If you can pop in and out as much as possible, they won't be expecting it. So it is just to make sure they're on task and just to make sure that they are trying to speak in English. However, if they are speaking in their native language, in their first language, as long as when they come back to the main lesson, they do understand the sort of process of how they got to their answers, because some people do simply work by translating directly from their first language. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, as long as when it comes to the freer activities, they are talking in English as much as possible. Now we're moving on to the activate stage of the lesson. So question for you guys, if you can write your answers in the chat box. So can you remember what the activate part of the lesson includes? So I'll just give you a moment to write your answers. Yep, so everyone's got it straight away. Freer use of the language, free practice, oral production, dialogues, discussions, the use of the language, and personalization as well. Perfect, so everyone's got it. So here, as you can see, we have discussion questions for students to complete in pairs. So you could put them into small groups in the breakout rooms that we just mentioned, or you could try a speed dating style activity where students have timed discussions with a partner, then they change and speak to a different partner. So you can put times on breakout rooms. You could do 3 or 4 minutes, for example. They're speaking about maybe question 1 and elaborating on it as much as possible. The breakout rooms end, they come back to the main lesson, then they go off into another one as well. But you do need to organise your breakout rooms before the main lesson. If you don't want to do something like that, you could simply have students perhaps make notes of their answers and unmute themselves. You can nominate them and they can say their answers, and you can have sort of a whole class discussion by having students nominate themselves as well, but just being careful that it is only one student unmuting themselves at a time. So yeah, it depends on the level of your students. You could get them to prepare notes, but you could also extend this activity by having students prepare their own questions using used to and would. So for example, where did you used to go on holiday with your family? What job did you used to want to have as well? So that's a really nice challenge for higher level students. So yeah, lower level students practicing notes perhaps first, higher level students extending the task by writing your own questions with the target language. And then you could even add another extension activity here just to bring the lesson all back together. So you could ask students to discuss the jobs in the pictures that we looked at from the first unit page. So they could describe what they think the positive and negatives are about them using the vocabulary from the lesson. So the extreme adjectives that we looked at. So for example, a positive thing about this job that we have on screen is working on an amazing beach in the boiling weather. So you could get students to look at the pictures and use the adjectives as well. As I say, this isn't in the student's book. This is just an extension activity idea. And now we're on to the final stage of our ESAP lesson. So now we're on the practice stage. So we've had our freer discussion in the breakout rooms or in the main lesson. And now we're really encouraging that autonomous learning. So we're going to give students homework activities, extra practice activities for self-study, support, for reinforcement of the language, and a challenge as well. So as we mentioned earlier, we have the extra grammar activity in the language bank on page 136. So if you are using this lesson, or if you are planning on using this lesson, do just feel free to take a note of these activities as well. So we also have the language bank on page 151, and activity 1A focuses on jobs. So again, that brings the lesson nicely back and links all the activities together. And then finally, at the end of every unit, there's a page called Look Back, which reviews and revises and recycles exactly what you looked over in the unit. So if you're teaching this lesson, you could use the extreme adjectives section and used to and would. So 3 and 4 on page 54. So Susan's just asked, how long do you think you should give to this lesson? Dilkash has also just asked the same. So you could do this in one lesson, or you could do this in 2. It really does depend if you want to add the extensions I mentioned, or if you prefer to just do some of the activities quickly, like the GIST listenings. So I would say that this could last about an hour and 15 minutes, perhaps even more, depending on how many students you have in your class. But as I say, you can just do the listening part of the lesson and add discussion questions, or just the grammar part and the discussion questions as well. So next, also for the practice section, we have the test generator, which is available on the Pearson English portal in your resources section. So you can generate a test on the content of the lesson or unit. So you can randomize the questions so each students get a different test. They're the same questions, but perhaps in a different order. So they're not sort of checking with each other, which is really, really useful. And students will get a notification on their My English Lab when they have a test assigned to them. So students go to their My English Lab and there will be their assigned activities. So students can access their grade book and complete the activities. And then teachers can access the gradebook to track the students' progress and see an error report which identifies the students' areas for improvement. So this can really reduce that long lesson planning time that you mentioned in the chat box earlier, by just allowing you to know which areas students are struggling with and what to focus on. So you can use this with your ESAP lesson planner to really cut down the time you spend as well. So there's also a study booster, and this provides extra pronunciation practice, which is really, really useful because often we don't get to hear our students speaking too much in the online classroom. And there's also extra reading and listening activities on there, as well as extra tips if you are teaching Spanish-speaking learners of English as well. And do remember that all of your audio, video, tests, and your active teach presentation for the class, where you're going to share your screen and use the digital version of the student's book, is all on the resources section of the Pearson English portal. So we'll put a link to this, I'm not sure if it's there already, in the chat box so that you can have easy access to this. So if you teach your lesson through your Pearson English portal, as I said, you have the Zoom capability on there as well. So it's really quick and easy. So everything's in one place. You don't need to worry about flicking from one platform to another. And then finally, we have the students' e-text, where students can go over the lesson again themselves if they want to. And they also have the audio available to play at the point of use. So someone asked this question earlier in the chat box. So as you can see here, we have the orange audio icons next to the activities. Students can directly click this and hear the audio. So yeah, here we have it on exercise 2A and 4B. Now, there are also some really interesting resources that you can use, not on your Pearson English portal, just online in general. Some of them you may have used. So they're really dynamic, really engaging, that you can add into your class. So we've got Padlet, which is an interactive noteboard you can use specifically for each class you have. So you can add photos, text, documents, respond to each other, audio clips and recordings. There's also Quizlet, which is really, really good to use. And I think a lot of teachers have actually used this. And it's free and it allows you to create self-study resources for your students. So flashcards, quizzes, for example, and students can make them for each other and share them too. And then we've got Flipgrid, which is an online video community where you can record a question or a talk and students respond to them. So a really nice idea for this might be an essay question. You could get them to do it orally. So give them the task and then they can record a 2 or 3 minute response to it as well. And then we also have Actively Learn. All of these are free or do have free resources, but you might need to pay if you do more than 5 classes, as some of you are suggesting as well. So Actively Learn, you can add questions or notes in response to an article on a website. So again, it's nice for collaborative learning. And then we've got WordWall, which is quite similar to Quizlet and Padlet. And then we've got Storybird, which is specifically aimed at practicing writing and creative stories. So all of this information will be in your How to Teach with Speak Out second edition guides, which you'll receive in your email 72 hours after the webinar. If you haven't received this, do just check the junk and spam box. Now, we've looked at the ESAT methodology for teaching online. We've had a look at a lesson from Speak Out second edition, which hopefully you can use in your online lessons. And we've also had a look at some resources available to teachers on the Pearson English portal and on other platforms as well. So I think we have time for some questions. I'll just give you a moment to write any questions you have in the chat box. So I'll just have a look back. So Rosemary asked about the test generator. Yes, so if you log onto your Pearson English portal and onto your resources, I think I have, here we go. So we've got the test generator. So once you click on that, it will come up each individual unit corresponding to the student's book, and you can click on it. There's up to 10 activities for each, and then you assign them, and then students will get a notification once it's assigned. Let's see what else we've got. Rachel said, how do I get authorization to link Zoom with the Pearson English portal? So once you've logged into your Pearson English portal, here we go. So it should look like this. So you'll have your classes and your Zoom at the top. So your resources and your Zoom. And then you will need to sign into your own Zoom account. If you don't have a paid Zoom account, it will just be the 40-minute limit. And then once you've logged in, so on the left-hand side here, you'll see the add button. That's where you log in, and then all of your classes will appear there. Let's have a look. Can you type into the ebook? You can't type into the ebook, but you can simply get students to write their answers in the chat box or make a note and discuss the answers as well. But the audio is ready to play in the student e-text as well. Let's have a look if we've got any more questions. What steps should we take to register the portal? So in the print version of your students and teachers book, on the inside cover there is a code. So you need to go to pearsonenglish.com/portal, enter that code, and then your book will come up with all the digital resources as well. Sonia asked, what do you suggest with early finishers? I suggest trying to sort of get them to maybe write their own example sentences using the target language or grammar point, for example, or perhaps writing questions that they can ask other students as well. So if there is a student who you know has finished early, get them to write a question, then you can get them to unmute themselves and nominate a student who can answer the question, for example. Okay, I think that is all the questions that we have. We have one more question. So, any suggestion for teaching speaking with my students? They're adults and teenagers, but they're A1. So that question's coming from Facebook. So that is a really, really good question. I think with A1, because the language ability is so low, we just need to start perhaps with chunks of language. So we can sort of say, how was your day? And hopefully they can say, I went shopping, for example. So if we can teach in chunks as much as possible, then students will hopefully be able to use that to sort of engage in dialogue. I also think using images as much as possible. So once we've taught the language, display any images or videos and get students to sort of use that language to describe something that they can associate with the real world as well. Okay, so I think that's all of the questions we have. If you do use this lesson in your online class, or if you do use the lesson in the how-to guide, do feel free to share it on social media with the hashtags on screen and let us know how it went. Just a reminder, this webinar was recorded and you will receive a link to rewatch it if you missed anything within 72 hours of this webinar. So do just monitor your spam or junk box as well if you haven't received that within 72 hours. You'll also receive a cheat sheet and the planner to reduce your planning time, as well as the online guide, How to Teach Online with Speak Out Second Edition, and your certificate of attendance. So thank you so much for all your participation and questions. And as I said, do let us know if you do use this framework in your lessons and how it goes. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much. Bye.